Hello and welcome to this, the first edition of Infrapod for 2025. Infrapod is the podcast of the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. I'm CECA's Chief Executive, Alasdair Reisner. Today we're just going to try and give you a bit of a run through what we can expect in the coming year for infrastructure. Try to look at this in terms of some of the key issues that will arise for members of CECA over the next year. We're going to break that down. So the themes we're going to look at, we've got policy. So obviously we had a change of government last year, but what's that going to mean as we roll into 2025 in terms of that new government setting policy in various areas? Also be looking at energy. I think probably for 2025, and we'll come on to it in a minute, that's going to be probably the big growth sector for industry. However, hot on its heels, I think we'll have water, which is also going to be growing apace in 2025. Again, we'll go through some of the reasons for that in the slides today. We'll look at roads. While the previous two sectors may feel like they're sprinting ahead, perhaps roads is going to have a bit more of a challenging year, and we'll talk about why that might be. And similarly for rail, although at least rail, I think it will definitely be an interesting year. Finally, we'll wrap things up just looking at people, some of the, beyond the sector, some of the big things that will be going on in terms of sort of skills and employment issues. However, with no further ado, let's get into the first area. So I put Rachel Reeves up here because it's probable that she's going to be the single most influential person for our sector in 2025. I mean, she's been influential in every year as Chancellor of the Exchequer, but that's particularly important this year because we do have a spending review coming up. When we look at sort of the influence over our sector, there are a few things that you can do that are more influential than setting the forward spending outlines for public sector investment in infrastructure. So it was the spending review for this year is actually the second phase. It is looking at the sort of the long-term spending. At the autumn budget, we did get some initial funding, basically to see us through a year, just to give the government a bit of a chance to take stock as to where things were. But yeah, this phase 2 will set 5-year capital budgets, and those will then subsequently be updated, topped up every 2 years. I think that's something that's really good, something that we've called for a long time in terms of giving better visibility of forward investment. However, while we may have sort of longer term capital budgets, I think one of the challenges is going to be they will come at a time when there is enormous pressure on public sector budgets, on public sector funds. So we kind of need to make the case for infrastructure again, as we always have to in the run-up to spending reviews, to ensure that there is sort of the funding for the investment in roads, in rail, in flood, all of those areas of public sector infrastructure spending. I think the government has been quite keen to impress upon everyone that they will be focusing on their 5 missions. These are the things that post the election in the summer last year, they set out as their 5 big things that they wanted to achieve during their time in government. Good news is, delivering economic growth is not just a mission, it is the number 1 mission for the government in terms of what it wants to achieve. So hopefully infrastructure plays into that. You know, we have consistently made the case that infrastructure is a driver of economic growth. So hopefully that gives us a good starting place in terms of driving that economic growth and supporting that growth mission. But I think perhaps one of the challenges we have is that, to an extent, some of this stuff is already baked in. We know from speaking to people across Whitehall, across Westminster, that although there's a spending review, we know a lot of the shape of some of that public sector funding, and that shape is influenced by the fact, as I said, there is not a lot of money to go around. So yeah, perhaps a challenging spending review, and maybe this time around fewer opportunities to influence sort of growth in budgets. I think sort of steady as you go in terms of public spending is about as much as we can expect. I'm not expecting a sort of massive giveaway in terms of radical new avenues of expenditure for infrastructure. So when is it going to happen? I think the latest officially is late spring. Anyone who works in and around Whitehall knows that late spring probably means the very back end of June, or probably the back end of May or bleeding into June 2025. And certainly there's some reporting that's come out that that's exactly when they are planning to have the spending review. So I think that's probably what we're looking at in terms of timing. Next area in terms of policy relates to, I've got a picture there of the Lower Thames crossing as an exemplar of the issue that this will be covering, because it's around planning. Talked about the government's missions, and I think that it definitely recognises that if it doesn't have a load of money to spend, it needs to do other measures to drive growth in the economy. And I think it sees that if it can get loads of infrastructure investment going, not necessarily infrastructure that it's investing in itself, but unlocking private sector investment in infrastructure, that might give it that sort of boost to growth without necessarily having to raid the exchequer in order to do it. So this is just the latest in a long line of attempts to sort of reform the way that consenting for infrastructure projects goes ahead. As I say, it is promoted heavily as something that's going to help deliver that growth mission. And it does very much focus on what are the things that happen in those sort of development consent order type processes, nationally significant infrastructure projects that could be streamlined. Really continuing some of the work that the previous government was doing in this space. It had recognised that existing reforms around major infrastructure hadn't landed, and projects were taking longer and longer to get through the consenting procedure. So this was, how can we speed that up? But it's not just a sort of big, chunky schemes level. Also putting more resources through this planning and infrastructure bill into local planning, changing the way that planning committees work, but just literally putting more cash into local planning authorities so that they've got more resource to deliver prompt planning decisions. So that's all great, but I think this is likely to face fairly severe opposition. We've seen that with previous attempts at planning reform. While there is, I think, quite a strong growth mantra within Labour, including some new MPs who've sort of formed themselves up as a group specifically focusing on growth. At the same time, there are a lot of organisations that have probably quite legitimate concerns about a free-for-all on planning, the likes of CPRE and others. So I think that this will face a challenge as it goes through Parliament. When that is, we don't know. Currently it's saying early 2025, so I'd suspect probably maybe February, March time we'd see the planning infrastructure bill entering Parliament. But yeah, I think in comparison to some of the other bills that I'll talk about today, planning infrastructure bill, I think will be highly contentious, and it will have a rough ride, even potentially with some Labour MPs. Alongside that, there is also a separate bit of work called the Banner Review, linked to this in terms of it looked at judicial reviews where they're being used to block or frustrate or hold up infrastructure projects. So the review happened under the last government. The outcome was published under this government, but the outcome was that they're looking to consult again on its findings. I think we will at some point this year see some of the outcomes from that, probably relatively early in 2025, but that might be another bit of activity that tries to ungum the wheels of planning for infrastructure across the UK, making it harder to take schemes through multiple judicial reviews where those judicial reviews have limited chance of success, but are just, in essence, used as a frustration tactic. So the next item of policy that we'll talk about, that's Darren Jones MP, Chief Secretary to Treasury, and he currently holds the brief for the development of the new National Infrastructure Strategy and NISTA. We'll come on to what NISTA is in a second. But yeah, National Infrastructure Strategy, it's not the first time the government will have developed a National Infrastructure Strategy. The last government had one. But this is really Labour setting out, for the first time since it came into power, what its long-term vision is for infrastructure. We're expecting it to come, as has a lot of things in this. It's due to be published around about the spending review. So that'll be interesting to see what the views are, because it's a review that doesn't just solely look at economic infrastructure, the kind of things that CECA members build, transport, utilities, power, but also social infrastructure like schools, hospitals and the like. So probably quite a detailed document, but hopefully helps to provide some policy certainty to industry around some of these key interventions in relation to infrastructure. Linked to that, we're expecting to see the launch of NISTA, so that's the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority. Bit of a mouthful, but it is really an amalgam of the former Infrastructure and Projects Authority and the National Infrastructure Commission, bringing both of their skill sets together as a single, hopefully more powerful body at the heart of Whitehall. It's something that we as a trade association called for, so delighted to see that going ahead. Just before Christmas, we saw adverts going out for the chief executive role within that, so it is definitely moving forward. And as I say, I think we will expect to see that happening around about the same time as spending review. They're talking about spring for a launch of NISTA. One other thing to say about it, potentially when there's not that much public sector funding available, there is the opportunity to bring private finance in to in instance, upfront finance projects with a longer term sort of payback period, whether that's through user charges or through some sort of PFI type arrangement. I don't think we will see PFI coming back on the table, but any new models of private finance, I would expect them to be in essence owned by NISTA, that, as I say, we expect to launch in the sort of the spring, late spring 2025. Final area of policy I think we'll look at is something that's been on the books for a little while. So Procurement Act 2023, as its name suggests, was given royal assent in 2023, but it had a period before it was due to be introduced. So this is really the sort of the clearing up of, if we've left Europe, one of the things that gives us the freedom to do is no longer follow the EU procurement regulations. But if we're not following those regulations, what are the new rules of the game in terms of procurement? So the Procurement Act hopefully sets that out. As I say, it was due in autumn 2024 to actually become to be introduced for the measures within it to be activated. With the new government coming in, they did postpone that. But in February this year, we're expecting the Act to really get its teeth and start to be implemented across all public sector organisations. It also feeds into utility organisations as well. So this is radical change for a lot of bodies that procure infrastructure across the industry. Some of the big ticket things in there. So first, under the old regs, there were quite a range of routes that procurers could take. That's been slimmed down significantly. So there's now an open procedure, which is basically anyone can bid for the particular contract. And the only other alternative is what they're calling a competitive flexible regime. So that the flexible in the name is probably the key point. It does really give a lot of power to the procuring organisation to decide how it wants to take the procurement forward. So I think the risk there is, do we end up in a bit of a free-for-all that everyone does their own thing and there's no consistency across the piece? So definitely something to watch out from February onwards. I think something more positive is under the old regs, there was something called MEET, or Most Economically Advantageous Tender. So in essence, a client had to award the contract based on who presented the most economically advantageous tender. And I think for a lot of organisations, what that meant to them was most economically advantageous meant lowest cost. So this, while I know that that wasn't specifically the meaning, and economically advantageous was attempting to cover a broader range of things than just cost, the move to most advantageous tender just gives that additional freedom to customers to really choose based on what delivers the best outcomes rather than what solely delivers the lowest cost. Another positive, I think, hopefully, is that everything will be hosted on a central digital platform. And when I say everything, that could be your contract tender notices, That could be the details or the bid documents. Crucially for suppliers, it could be your information about your organization. So that nirvana that we've often talked about there being a single repository for PQQ data. I don't think this delivers that in spades, but it perhaps moves us on the road towards having that. At the minute, it's just some pretty basic information about your company. So your name, your location, I think your insurances and things like that are on there. But over time, I think it gives us a platform to build from. And hopefully over time, we can start to extend that common information so that companies aren't having to stick in their sort of bid information in multiple forms for multiple customers over and over again. One final point in relation to this, and it's sort of been flagged up as something that's a note of caution, is that the Procurement Act does create what they call debarment. Under the old regs, it was actually quite difficult to block poor performing suppliers from bidding for contracts under the European regs. I think the new debarment regime gives reasons why you can say we're just not even going to allow you to bid for a contract that is perhaps broader than what has gone before. Flagged up as a real concern, people might be blocked from bidding, but my personal view on this is let's watch and see how it plays out. But I reckon you will have to have done something pretty egregious, sort of law-breaking or really long-term poor performance before you would be subject to debarment. But it is definitely something that we will be watching as we go forward, just to see how that is implemented. But yeah, definitely February 2025. It's a bit like the Millennium Bug. We won't know what it's like until it happens in many ways. But yeah, definitely one to watch out for in February. So moving on to the sectors, I've put energy first just because, as I said right at the start, I think this is probably one of those areas that's going to be the biggest in terms of its impact on CECA members in the coming years, certainly in 2025. So just before Christmas, the government published Clean Power 2030, its action plan. This is really linked to one of its core missions. So as well as driving economic growth, the government says it wants to deliver clean power by 2030, become a clean energy superpower, I think is the language that they use. So this is about how they can pretty much decarbonise all of electricity generation in the UK by 2030. There'll still be a little bit of gas turbine power available for when the sort of renewables isn't available. But generally, the aim is to provide 100% of our energy needs or our electricity needs from clean power by 2030. So that's big ticket stuff. As I say, the action plan was published just before Christmas. There's a lot of meat in there. I might do a separate video on it, just because I think it's worth getting to grips with that action plan. But some of the key things is really big transition towards wind and solar. We've already seen significant investment in offshore wind, but one of the first things that the government did when it came into power was enable onshore wind in England, which had been subject to an effective moratorium under the last government. I think we'll also see a radical uplift in the amount of solar that we see under this Clean Power by 2030 plan. The cost of solar panels has dropped significantly in recent years. And so although the UK is probably not the most blessed with solar power potential, it wouldn't surprise me to see very significant use of solar power across the UK over the next 5 years. Those are probably the areas where we're going to see the biggest growth, but the plan also notes growth in nuclear. Well, that's not a surprise because obviously Hinkley Point is currently being built. So when that comes onto the bars, that will give a big boost, albeit there are other existing nuclear power stations that are reaching the end of their life. But I think we're also in the slightly longer term, you might be looking at things like small modular reactors, some of the other existing reactor sites, whether they would come forward. Obviously, Sizewell C is close to consideration. We might get a final decision on that in 2025. hydrogen. Government's got a hydrogen strategy and has sort of big aspirations for hydrogen infrastructure. It's putting a lot of money into various forms of hydrogen-based infrastructure. And it's certainly plugging a huge amount of money into carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which we saw just before Christmas. Net Zero Teesside, one of the really big carbon capture projects, essentially the first stages of that being given the go-ahead. Alongside that, it's not just about generating, it's also about how we store it. I talked earlier about the fact that obviously with renewables being intermittent, there's a challenge of, what happens when the wind doesn't blow, what happens to the solar when the sun's not shining. So I think we'll see a very significant increase in energy storage, whether that's through battery storage or whether things like hydropower schemes. So I think 2025 will see quite significant uplift in projects in that space as well. Plan also talks about something that I discussed in a previous slide, which is we need to sort out the planning for a lot of this. Often some of this stuff is contentious. People perhaps not wanting transmission cables through their back garden, not wanting nuclear power stations built nearby, not wanting hydrogen. All of these things have to go through the consenting process. So I think a big part of this action plan is linked back to the infrastructure and planning bill. So trying to streamline some of these things to go through rather than getting stuck in planning hell. Linked to that, it doesn't matter how much generation you put in if you don't have the connections. I think there has been a recognition that a lot of work needs to be done on prioritising connections. So the Clean Power 2030 Action Plan does talk about, of the, I think, 100 gigawatts of electricity schemes that there are currently in planning for connections, actually saying, well, which of these schemes are the ones that are most likely to deliver the Clean Power 2030 mission, and pushing them up the league table so that they get their connections quickly, whereas other schemes that are a bit more sort of speculative, pie in the sky, might never have happened, maybe find it a bit harder to get their connections. So I think that's an area we're going to see a lot of activity, and we're already starting to see procurement of partners to deliver some of those connections. And I think those procurements are focusing on some of the really big, important connections, transition to distribution projects. Finally, perhaps the biggest challenge for all of this, alongside the need to finance all of it, is the supply chain constraints, because perhaps electricity hasn't been one of the glamour sectors of the industry in recent years. There is significant pressure on the supply chain. There's perhaps not enough people, not enough materials, not enough products available in the market to deliver on this aspiration for Clear Power 2030. So yeah, it definitely feels like that there needs to be an action plan to deliver an uplift in that supply chain capacity. And that's what the action plan published before Christmas starts to talk to. So yeah, energy definitely a real growth area for 2025. So the next area is water. Huge area of growth for the sector. Looking at just before Christmas, we had the periodic review from Ofwat, which looks at the amount of allowable investment over the next 5 years. It's talking about record levels of investment, particularly in enhancements to the water network. To give you an idea of the scale of that, it's moving to £104 billion worth of investment over the next 5 years. That equivalent figure last time round was 51 billion. So more than doubling in terms of the overall spend in water. And actually within that, the enhancement spend is probably more like a trebling of investment. So really big growth in the water sector. All of this is due to kick off in April this year. I think that there will be some challenges here because it is a huge amount of work, particularly around leaks and stormwater overflows, sort of politically contentious area in relation to, in essence, crap getting into rivers and other water courses. So a real political drive to do this stuff, but as with the energy stuff, huge challenges on the resource to deliver that. And that is probably exacerbated by the fact that it's not just that sort of PR24, the AMP8 program. You've also got some major investments, some of which sit within AMP8, but also some which are even bigger, longer-term strategic projects. So that includes 6 new reservoirs, to give you an idea. The last mega reservoir that was delivered in the UK was Kielder Reservoir. That was late 70s, early 80s. We're talking about 6 new reservoirs, many of which are not quite on the scale of Kielder, but very, very large reservoirs in the south of England, in the Midlands. So all kicking off within a few years of each other. So big supply chain requirements for that, along with 11 water transfer projects. So talking about a sort of national grid for water, being the ability to transfer water from areas of excess to areas of shortage around the UK, and some really gutsy treatment works projects and a desalination works project as well. So really big ticket investments in the water sector. I was at an event a few weeks ago where they were talking about water suddenly being sexy. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but definitely water is very much in vogue at the moment. So if that's what's in vogue, perhaps the areas that are facing a bit more challenge. So highways, roads is definitely a market that's facing a bit of a plateau, it's fair to say, at the moment. The big thing we would have expected last year was the road investment strategy, the third version of that. It was due spring last year, but that was put on hold because of the election. And so we are now not due to see that until the spending review. That actually means that it may be published after the previous road investment strategy was due to come to a close in April. So in terms of certainty, I think highways is a bit of a challenging market at the moment, not helped by the fact that because of some of the cost inflation that we saw off the back of COVID and Ukraine and similar, there's quite a backlog from the previous road investment strategy. So it doesn't feel like there's going to be a whole load of new investment in roads in the coming 5 years. It'll be pretty much steady as she goes. And actually, when you take inflation into account, probably a bit of a decline in the highways market in the future. At the same time, there's new pressures coming, or maybe old pressures that were just coming to roost, because we are seeing increasing concerns about the state of 1960s and 70s structures that were built across not just highways, but across all transportation networks. Sort of reinforcement, the concrete within some of those structures just coming to the end of its design life and failing. Just before Christmas, we saw the example in Gateshead, where a flyover that in essence supports traffic going onto the Tyne Bridge, the local council, Gateshead Council, had to close it because they, in essence, didn't have confidence in the structure. That not only affected the road servicing the Tyne Bridge, but actually also because it went over the metro, the light rail in Newcastle, Gateshead, it closed that down for a number of days as well. And I don't think that this is a unique example. I think we will see more and more concerns about existing structures. In October, CECA ran an event on the specific subject, aging assets, and I think it's something that's going to be in vogue and in discussion in 2025. So, as with roads, we move to rail. I think some of the challenges we've seen in roads, we're probably going to see reflected in rail as well. But as I said in the introduction, I think we're definitely also seeing some interesting things happening in rail this year, not the least of which will be the Railways Bill. So currently we've got something called Shadow Great British Railways. That was established back in September. Now, Great British Railways ultimately is this attempt to bring back together tracks and trains after years of privatisation. So it's currently in shadow form because it needs a parliamentary bill in order to create the legislation for it. The challenge there is when will that bill come forward? I think people are talking about summer next year, but that feels quite ambitious. There is a lot of work to be done there, just purely because ultimately the railways that we're talking about, Department for Transport, we're talking about Network Rail, we're talking about some of what were historically the train operating companies, all being brought together under the auspices of Great British Railways. And that's a lot of moving parts, some of which may not want to move together. So yeah, it feels challenging to get that into the House in a bill that's acceptable to everyone by the summer. But we'll wait and see. Certainly, I think one of the challenges is while it's not happening, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. I think if you're a supplier working for Network Rail at the moment, you've not only got the challenges of the creation of Great British Railways, but you've also got the uncertainty, as we saw in highways, where inflation driven by things like Ukraine is meaning that programs of work are unaffordable, and there is no additional funds. So I think just generally across the piece, rail, like highways, feels like a bit of an uncertain market at the moment. Perhaps controversially, a bit more positivity in relation to HS2, because while it's definitely been in the headlines for a number of years around some of the challenges, that when we look at some of those challenges for Network Rail, part of that is because of the massive cost escalation that we have seen for HS2. But while all of this has been going on quietly along the length of the route, work has been getting on a pace in terms of the delivery of HS2. And I think just before Christmas, HS2 did start putting out some material about where things are with the project. And there is a huge amount of major work that is now complete from a civil engineering point of view. Major earthworks done, major tunnelling, culvert viaduct, huge multi-kilometre viaduct. Essentially, from a construction point of view, pretty much close to completion. So I think hopefully what this is going to start showing the public is that HS2 is getting on with delivery, and despite some of the cost pressures, it is creating an asset that is going to be a massive plus for the UK going forward. That's not to say there are not challenges. Euston, where they do need to bring the trains into at the London end, there's still not a competent plan for how that's going to happen. Hugely expensive. You've got National Rail Services coming in there, you've got HS2 services, but you bring them into a site that also needs to be a development plot that can be used to develop significant volumes of commercial or residential that can at least help meet the bill for all of the work that needs to be done. And we're talking billions of pounds. So trying to square away all of those, I think Euston is still a challenge, and I'm not sure we're quite there yet on a solution. And if we're not there on a solution for Euston, I think what happens north of Birmingham is even further away. There's no doubt that the Leeds eastern leg of this was dead years ago, but I think there was always some hope that although the Manchester leg was cancelled under the last government, that some sort of solution could be found there. And so, unfortunately, I think where we are now is, although alternatives have been proposed, I think none of those are currently acceptable to the Department, to Treasury. So it all feels a long way off, while at the same time, the solution that's required is needed, because as it stands, if delivered to the constraints of the current proposal, you would actually get lower capacity between Birmingham and Manchester than you currently have, which is clearly unacceptable as a way forward. So yeah, phase 2, I think, is dead. There are, we've got things like Northern Powerhouse Rail, got Liverpool to Manchester Rail plans. There's a lot of things sort of sitting there in the ether. But yeah, I put there feels a long way off. And yeah, I'd probably stand by that. I'm not sure we're close to seeing a solution for what's going to go on for the sort of the north of Birmingham elements of HS2. So that's probably covers off the sectors. But I did want to touch very quickly on people as well. So I think the two big things that we'll see happening that will affect CECA members in relation to people will be, first, we've got Skills England, which is going to be created. So this is, in essence, a new body, as the name suggests, to oversee skills in England. The bill is due in Parliament. It was in the King's Speech, so we know a little bit about it, but we don't know when that bill is due to come into Parliament. I would suspect sort of middle of 2025, but we don't yet know. It's in essence there to sort of understand what the skills needs are of UK business, and then try to put in place the interventions that will support that. It is currently in shadow format looking at key sectors. good news is that construction is one of those key sectors. So we would expect to see some skills assessments put in place this year that try to outline how we can meet the skills challenges for the UK construction industry. That also links to a new skills and growth levy, which in essence is an evolution of the apprenticeship levy, which hopefully means that there will be funding to support some of this investment in skills that's required. Second thing that I just wanted to touch upon is the Employment Rights Bill. Now this is in Parliament. The bill went into Parliament in, I think, the late autumn, and it's really a quite radical overhaul of workers' rights. I think it's something that we as an organisation have been broadly supportive of. In essence, in a sector that needs people, it's important there's good relationships between our employer members and the employees that they have working for them. I think there are some areas of concern that have been flagged up, some quite aggressive bringing forward of rights to employees having a lot of rights on day one in areas such as unfair dismissal that I think could potentially cause some concern, where it might become increasingly difficult to hire people if you don't know whether they're going to be the right person for your organisation, and some specific issues about redundancy, where construction is obviously a site-based industry, so how we manage that, where it's looking to, in essence, aggregate all redundancies at an organisational level rather than at a site-based level. So a few things that we need to sort of pick through there. But yeah, I think as and when the bill gets through, and I think it will, I think it'll have strong support from a Labour government, understandably. I think it is one of those things that industry will need to be aware of, and we are briefing members on all of this, try to keep you up to speed with what's going on in that space. So that is a quick canter on the 1st of January through some of the things that I personally think are going to be important to members over the course of 2025. We're very keen to hear from you all as to whether there are issues that we've talked about today that you're interested in. So please do let us know if you're interested in anything you've heard about. Do also tell us what you think of the podcast. This is episode 2. Is it worth doing episode 3 and beyond? But other than that, it remains just to wish you a very happy new year and look forward to working with you all for the rest of 2025. Thank you.